So let's talk pistons. Pistons can be rigged in any number of ways. They can be rigged using set-driven keys. They can be rigged using expressions, nodes, things like that. But I like to keep it fairly simple, pretty straightforward, using things that are really familiar. So first of all, of course, we need our geometry. So what I have here is I have a simple, basically a simple piston and basically a simple shaft for it to actually receive the piston. Okay, so first of all, when I'm going to set this up to function relative to the movement of another part, or basically relative to a joint structure that's going to be controlling the geometry, of course you need the joints. So let's just show the joint structure here. Okay, so a couple things about the joints. Let me take a look at this from our side view. And let's change our background, make it a little easier to see. Okay, so you'll see a couple of things here. I have essentially, let's say, the joint chain for the, let's say, a mechanical arm or leg that's going to basically be driven by our piston and our hydraulics. So in this case, though, we want to create a separate joint to essentially anchor the cylinder and the piston. Okay? And so in this case, I've created right here, which would be the root of the joint of the chain in this case. I've actually created a small branching off for a joint to basically stabilize the cylinder and one for the piston. So what I did first is I took the geometry for the piston and I constrained it, or actually I bound it to my joint at the base. You can bind it, you can parent it, you can strain it, you can do whatever you want as long as it's actually going to respond to the movement of this joint. Okay, as you can see. Same thing for the cylinder up top and any related parts. So I added this part here just to make the cylinder stand out a little bit, also so I can tell which direction it's facing. And that's going to be something that comes into play a little bit later. So take the geometry for your cylinder and same thing. Select the joint that you want to connect it to and make sure you connect it to that joint. In this case, I did a smooth bind using selected joints as my base setting. And so it's bound to that joint. Okay? Now, the first stage in setting up the behavior of the piston, and actually probably the most important, is essentially constraints. Now in this case we have our cylinder up top and we have our piston at the bottom. Now we know that when the joint actually rotates, I have an IK on this chain, when I actually grab the IK handle, which is actually connected not to the anchoring joints for the piston and the cylinder, but to the end of the joint chain that the essentially the hydraulics are supposed to correspond to. Okay, so when I actually pull this, you see that it doesn't actually control our anchoring joints for our piston and our cylinder directly. It's an indirect influence, which is what you want. But what we need to happen is we need to have the piston essentially aiming at the cylinder and the cylinder aiming at the piston. And so that's pretty easy to do. What you're going to do is you select the joint for your piston, shift select the joint for the cylinder, and then you're going to go to constrain, aim constraint, and go to your option box. Always bring up your option box so you know what your settings are. Now let's take a look. Now these are the default settings for the aim constraint. Now one of the first things you want to turn on is you want to activate maintain offset. And this is so that if there are any orientation variations between the target and basically the object being aimed at, that it doesn't cause your geometry to angle off vector. The next thing is you want to pay attention to the orientation of the world and of the joints that you're working with. So by default, the up vector is set to 1 on the Y, which is correct. Okay, and then we have the aim vector. Now the aim vector is always going to be relative to basically the objects being aimed and being aimed at. So what you want to do is make sure that your aim vector actually corresponds to the orientation of the object being aimed. This way it doesn't have to create any offset in the rotation, and that actually decreases the chances of the constraint sort of flipping out while you're working with it. Although there are ways to try to get around that as well. So in this case I have my piston joint and my cylinder joint selected. So remember, what you're selecting first is going to basically be what's in control, and then what you're selecting second is going to be controlled. That's the order for constraints. Okay, so basically our cylinder is going to try to aim at our piston joint. So it's going to basically become the target. Okay, so with our default settings, let me take a closer look. Go to perspective. I want to take a quick look at the orientation of our joint. Now, if you can see it, I'll go rotation axes. Make sure I'm showing all. Okay, so as you can see, we have our y-axis is aiming up from that joint. And it should be the same for our piston joint. Okay, so essentially that's going to be the vector we want our joints to aim along. And right now, by default, they're set to aim along the x. So what you do is you set that to 0. And now in this case, the y is going to be the center one. So you hit 1 for that. And then you press apply. And what you can do is to make sure that it actually worked, you can just check it here. Okay. Now, in this case, it actually didn't work properly because it's the cylinder joint which is being constrained, and it basically needs to aim down at our piston joint. So what you want to do is, instead of setting it for +1, set it for -1. So you set it for -1, and then you apply it. And as you can see now the rotations are completely zeroed out on that joint, so it doesn't actually have to flip around to aim at anything. So it doesn't shift the orientation or the positions of the geometry at all. Everything should be aiming at what it needs to aim at. And then basically you're going to do the reverse for the piston joint. Now if we check it before we even do that, if I grab my IK handle, you can see that our cylinder is actually aiming perfectly at the root of our piston joint. Okay, so now we need to get the piston to do the same thing. So we select the joint for our cylinder, shift select the joint for your piston, and you're going to need to reverse the vector because now that piston needs to aim up towards the cylinder. And so we apply that, and again our rotate should stay at 0 for that joint relative to the vector that we've set. So now when I test it, you can see that the piston is actually working perfectly. So if you go for that sort of train piston motion, so it's chugging right along, no problem, it's aiming perfectly. I mean, the only thing you have to look out for here is make sure that you actually have enough piston to basically work with the behavior that you need. And of course, a nice trick you can do if let's say your geometry is going to come up a little short is you could, when you're doing your binding, you could bind your piston so that one end of it is anchored to the cylinder and the other is anchored to the piston, essentially anchored to the piston, so that when it does extend to a point where it would be longer than the geometry, it would technically stretch the geometry so that there'd never be any sort of visible disconnect unless you have a texture on there that shows that there is stretching going on. Now, one of the last things you can do, one of the last things you might encounter when it comes to this setup is sometimes you might encounter sort of a flipping in the objects that are constrained. So what you can do is you can select the joint, and you need to find the constraint that's controlling it, and you can do a couple of different things with it. Go to your attribute editor, find the tab that corresponds to your constraint, and then find where it says under the aim constraint attributes, find where it says world up type, and you can set that to object up. Then what you can do is you go to create a locator, and basically you can create a locator that you can use to control essentially where it basically aims or tries to aim the constraint relative to that object. So if you set this object up properly, it should prevent the constraint from flipping out when the orientation of your rig changes too drastically for it to essentially remain stable. So I'm just going to call this one aim, and we'll call it piston, aim piston. Okay, And so what you want to do is take that name, copy it, go back to your constraint, and then just paste that name in there. Okay? Once you paste it in there, it should basically try to look for that object relative to its position, and that should help it to try to prevent it from sort of flipping out. It's basically you only really need to add this as a just in case. And ultimately, usually what I'll do is I'll take this and I'll usually parent it to the same joint that our piston joint's anchored to. This way everything stays aligned and relative to each other. So even when you're actually using things, if it overextends, doesn't matter, it's always going to try to maintain its relative orientation. Okay, so our piston works fine. Now, just to play it safe, you usually want to create an aim target for both the piston and for the cylinder joints. And you want to make them separate. You don't want to use the same one because it can cause some odd behavior in your joint structure. It gets a little confused, I think. So again, what you want to do is create locator, name your locator, of course. I'm going to name mine aim, and we'll say piston. And we'll say up just to keep it straight. Okay, move it into position. Just put it someplace in line with your joint structure. And I usually like to scale it down using its local scale value. Doesn't have to be big. And if you want to, you can even freeze the translates to lock in its position as default. And then again, I'm going to parent it into the joint structure, not to the joint it's controlling, but above it in the hierarchy. Okay, so essentially both joints are anchored to the same point, or so to say, the locator and the joint are anchored to the same joints. Okay, and then once again, select your joint, attribute editor, find the constraint, go to world up type, set it for up object, and then put in the name of your aim target. Go to my world up object, paste that in there, and it should start working immediately. When you select the locator, you'll see that the joint highlights to show that it is being influenced. And so that's sort of the last part you need to do if you need to stabilize your joint for some reason.